Daily life inside Texas death row, the Allan B. Polunsky Unit. On December 7, 2000, at 6:18 p.m., Texas executed Claude Jones by lethal injection. He maintained his innocence until the syringe pierced his skin. 12 years later, DNA evidence would prove he was telling the truth. But by then, the state had already killed him. Claude Jones spent his final years in a place designed to break the human spirit before the state ends it, the Allan B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas. 23 hours a day in a concrete box the size of a parking space. No human touch. No windows. No hope. This is America's most restrictive death row, where nearly 300 men wait to die. What happens to a human mind when you know the exact building where you'll take your last breath? When you spend years, sometimes decades, in near total isolation, waiting for the state to schedule your death? The men inside Polunsky Unit will tell you, death isn't the punishment. The waiting is. But to understand how it came to this, we need to go back to the moment Texas decided that death row inmates didn't deserve to be treated like human beings anymore. This video discusses real criminal cases and contains mature themes including descriptions of violent crimes and the death penalty. It's intended for educational purposes and to examine the criminal justice system. Viewer discretion is advised. The Allan B. Polunsky Unit sits on 1,381 acres of former farmland in Polk County, deep in East Texas. When it opened in 1993, it was called the Terrell Unit, a maximum security prison designed to house the state's most dangerous inmates. Back then, Texas death row was at the Ellis Unit in Huntsville, where condemned men lived in a general population setting. They could work prison jobs, attend religious services together, eat meals in a cafe tag hall, even play basketball in the yard. That all changed on Thanksgiving Day, 1998. Martin Gurley became the first condemned inmate to escape from Texas death row in 64 years. He and 6 other inmates overpowered guards, scaled razor wire fences, and disappeared into the night. Gurley drowned in a creek a week later, but the damage was done. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice faced national humiliation. Prison officials made a decision that would transform death row into something America had never seen before. In 1999, they moved all condemned inmates to the Polunsky Unit and implemented a policy called administrative segregation, a bureaucratic term for solitary confinement. Looking back, there were signs this would become one of the cruelest practices in American corrections. Human rights organizations warned that prolonged isolation could constitute torture. Psychologists testified that extreme isolation causes irreversible mental damage. Texas didn't care. They wanted control. They wanted security. They got something else entirely. They got a laboratory for studying what happens when you systematically destroy human sanity while keeping bodies alive. Everything changed on death row after that move. The men who arrived at Polunsky in 1999 thought they understood what death row meant. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Picture this. You wake up at 3 in the morning. Not because you want to, but because the fluorescent lights in your cell never turn off. They burn into your eyelids 24 hours a day. You've been trying to sleep on a concrete slab with a thin mattress, but the prisoner in the next cell has been screaming for hours. He does this every night now. After 7 years in isolation, his mind has fractured. Your cell measures 60 square feet. That's roughly 6 feet by 10 feet. In this space, you have a metal bunk, a combination sink and toilet made of stainless steel, and a concrete desk attached to the wall. There's a narrow window on your cell door, the only way to see outside this box. Through it, you can see other cell doors stretching down the corridor. You cannot see another human face. You've been in this cell for 23 hours straight. Yesterday, you got your 1 hour of recreation. They took you, in handcuffs and leg shackles, to another concrete box called a recreation cage. It's outdoors but enclosed on all sides by concrete walls and metal grating overhead. You couldn't see the sky. You couldn't see the horizon. You paced in circles for 60 minutes, then guards returned you to your cell. This is every single day at the Polunsky Unit. According to court documents filed by death row prisoners, the isolation is absolute. You cannot have contact visits. When family members come, you speak through a plexiglass barrier using a telephone. You haven't felt human touch in years, except when guards handcuff you. You cannot attend religious services with other inmates. You cannot work a prison job. You cannot take educational classes with others. You eat every meal alone in your cell. What they believed would create a more secure death row became something far darker, a systematic destruction of human psychology. But what happened next would change everything. As months turned to years, prisoners began exhibiting behaviors that shocked even veteran corrections officers. Men who entered Polunsky mentally healthy began displaying severe psychiatric symptoms. According to medical records obtained through litigation, inmates developed what psychologists call isolation syndrome, a constellation of symptoms including paranoia, hypersensitivity to stimuli, hallucinations, panic attacks, and cognitive deterioration. Robert Pruitt spent years on Polunsky's death row. In interviews before his 2017 execution, he described hearing voices that weren't there, seeing shadows moving in his peripheral vision, losing his ability to hold conversations when given the rare chance to speak with someone. Your brain starts eating itself, he said. You forget what people's faces look like. You forget what grass smells like. You become this thing that isn't quite human anymore. The sensory deprivation is carefully calculated. You cannot see trees, grass, or the horizon. Natural light barely reaches most cells. The temperature is controlled, you can't feel weather changes. The only sounds are mechanical, metal doors clanging, ventilation systems humming, and other prisoners deteriorating mentally. Little did they know, a Yale psychiatrist named Dr. Craig Haney would eventually study these conditions and testify that the Polunsky Unit's death row represents one of the most restrictive prison environments in the United States. His research, conducted over multiple visits, documented that prolonged isolation of this severity causes permanent psychological damage. Some men tried to resist the mental deterioration. They created routines, exercising in their tiny cells, writing letters, reading every book they could access from the limited prison library. But the system is designed to defeat even these small acts of dignity. Mail is heavily censored. Phone calls are limited and expensive. Books are restricted. And the rules change arbitrarily. Something allowed today might be contraband tomorrow. By the time most men have spent 5 years in these conditions, something fundamental has broken. Their thoughts become disordered. Their emotions become unstable. Some become catatonic. Others become explosive. The truth was far darker than anyone imagined. Texas created a death row where men die psychologically long before the state injects lethal chemicals into their veins. That decision would haunt the criminal justice system forever. In 2002, attorneys began filing lawsuits challenging the conditions at Polunsky. They argued that keeping death row inmates in extreme isolation for years, sometimes decades, violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The evidence they uncovered would shock even veteran civil rights lawyers. Medical records revealed a mental health crisis. According to court filings, approximately 40% of death row inmates at Polunsky were receiving psychotropic medications. Men with no prior history of mental illness were developing severe psychiatric disorders. Prison psychiatrists documented symptoms consistent with serious mental deterioration, inmates smearing feces, self-mutilation, suicide attempts, complete psychological breakdowns. Police said the isolation was necessary for security. But witnesses claimed something different. Corrections officers testified that the extreme isolation wasn't about safety, it was about punishment. Some guards privately admitted the conditions were inhumane. One former officer told reporters, "You watch men lose their minds in there. They come in criminals, but we're turning them into something worse." The evidence painted a disturbing picture. Death row inmates who violated minor rules faced even harsher restrictions. They could lose their already limited recreation time, their access to the commissary, their phone privileges. The system operated on a philosophy that these men had nothing left to lose, so the only way to control them was through increasingly severe deprivation. Conflicting accounts emerged about what solitary confinement actually does to the human brain. Prison officials argued that inmates were housed rather than isolated, claiming the conditions were necessary and appropriate. But mental health experts testified that prolonged isolation, anything beyond 15 days, meets the international definition of torture. What happened next would change everything. In 2008, the case Ruiz versus Texas challenged the extreme isolation policies. Prisoners argued that Texas was deliberately inflicting severe psychological harm. Expert witnesses presented brain imaging studies showing that isolation causes measurable changes to brain structure. The hippocampus shrinks, the prefrontal cortex shows reduced activity, stress hormones remain chronically elevated. The court acknowledged the severity of the conditions but ultimately ruled that while the isolation was harsh, it didn't violate constitutional standards. The judge noted that death row inmates had been convicted of capital murder, and that some restriction was necessary for institutional security. But the story doesn't end there. The legal battles revealed system failures that extended beyond Polunsky's walls. If officials had implemented meaningful mental health treatment, conducted regular psychiatric evaluations, or offered any form of rehabilitative programming, the psychological destruction might have been preventable. Instead, Texas chose the cheapest option: lock them down and leave them there. Public reaction divided sharply. Victims' families argued that murderers deserved no sympathy. These men had shown no mercy to their victims. Why should society show mercy to them? But families of death row inmates described watching their loved ones mentally disintegrate during visits, unable to hold coherent conversations, displaying symptoms of severe mental illness that hadn't existed before incarceration. Religious leaders, including several Texas prison chaplains, spoke out about the moral implications. They argued that even if someone deserves death as punishment for their crimes, society has an obligation not to torture them psychologically while waiting for execution. The question became, does death row serve justice, or does it serve cruelty? The investigation revealed something far more sinister. In multiple cases, inmates who had been determined competent to stand trial gradually became incompetent while on death row due to the isolation. This created a legal paradox. The Eighth Amendment forbids executing someone who is mentally incompetent, but the conditions of death row itself were causing that incompetence. Texas's solution? Forcibly medicate prisoners to restore enough mental capacity to execute them. After years in these conditions, men develop survival tactics that would disturb most people. They're not violent tactics. Violence is nearly impossible when you're locked in a cell alone. These are psychological survival mechanisms, ways of preserving some fragment of sanity in an environment designed to destroy it. Some men create elaborate fantasy worlds. According to mental health evaluations, inmates spend hours each day in detailed imaginary scenarios, conversations with people who aren't there, memories replayed and embellished until they're more vivid than present reality, entire fictional lives constructed in their minds. Psychologists call this dissociation, and it's both a coping mechanism and a symptom of deterioration. Others find connection in the smallest interactions. Death row inmates develop a communication system called phishing. They tie threads to objects and pass items cell to cell under the doors. Books, letters, drawings, anything that can slide across the concrete. They also communicate by shouting through vents, creating a crude network of voices echoing through steel and concrete. Relationships form between men who have never seen each other's faces. The psychological impact manifests differently in each prisoner. Some men become hyper-religious, finding meaning in faith when everything else has been stripped away. Others become nihilistic, embracing the death that's coming because it means an end to the waiting. Many lose their ability to interact normally. When they do get human contact during legal visits or psychiatric evaluations, they can't make eye contact, can't modulate their voice properly, can't interpret social cues. Ongoing struggles extend beyond the psychological. Death row inmates at Polunsky must navigate complex legal battles while their mental capacity deteriorates. Many represent themselves in appeals because they don't trust appointed attorneys. They spend hours in their cells researching case law, filing motions, desperately searching for some legal pathway to overturn their conviction or at least delay their execution. Family relationships collapse under the strain. Spouses divorce. Children stop visiting because seeing their father through plexiglass, watching him mentally deteriorate, becomes too traumatic. Parents age and die while their sons remain locked in concrete boxes, unable to attend funerals, unable to say goodbye. Are they getting better or worse? The statistics are grim. According to research on long-term isolation, psychological damage becomes increasingly severe and irreversible after the first year. By 5 years, most prisoners exhibit symptoms of serious mental illness. By 10 years, the damage is permanent. Reintegration into even general prison population becomes nearly impossible. Men who spend decades in isolation cannot handle the sensory input of normal social interaction. Some shocking details about the system emerge in legal documents. Death row prisoners at Polunsky can be held in isolation for 30 years or more while their appeals process continues. Texas has executed men who spent 3 decades in these conditions. The longest-serving death row inmate in the United States, Raymond Riles, has been in isolation since 1976, 48 years. His attorneys argue he's now mentally incompetent, suffering from dementia exacerbated by decades of isolation. The daily reality includes deprivations most people never consider. You cannot hug your children. You cannot attend your parents' funeral. You cannot feel sunlight on your skin or wind on your face. You cannot pet a dog, eat a meal cooked with care, or experience privacy. Guards watch you through the cell door window. Cameras monitor you constantly. Even your most basic bodily functions occur under surveillance. After decades of this, something unexpected happened. Some men found ways to retain their humanity. They became jailhouse lawyers, helping other inmates with appeals. They wrote poetry, created art with the limited materials available, mentored younger inmates through the vent system. These small acts of resistance against dehumanization became, for some, the only thing preventing complete psychological collapse. In recent years, new evidence has emerged about wrongful convictions on Texas death row. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, at least 16 men have been exonerated from Texas death row since 1976. That means 16 innocent men spent years, some of them decades, in the conditions at Polunsky Unit before their innocence was proven. Cameron Todd Willingham wasn't one of them. Texas executed him in 2004 for setting a fire that killed his 3 daughters. Years later, 9 of the nation's leading fire scientists reviewed the evidence and concluded that the fire was not arson, it was an accident. The forensic evidence used to convict him was based on outdated and scientifically invalid methods. If those experts are correct, Texas executed an innocent man. The appeals process offers little hope. Since the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, federal courts have extremely limited ability to review state death penalty cases. Men on death row face increasingly restrictive procedural barriers to getting their cases heard. Even credible claims of innocence or constitutional violations often get dismissed on technicalities. To this day, no one knows exactly how many innocent people are currently on death row. Conservative estimates suggest that approximately 4% of death sentences are imposed on innocent defendants. In Texas, with nearly 200 men on death row, that could mean 8 or more innocent men are currently held in isolation at Polunsky, mentally deteriorating while they try to prove their innocence in a legal system stacked against them. Where are they now? Some death row inmates have been there for so long that the Polunsky Unit is the only world they remember as adults. They entered in their 20s, now they're in their 50s or 60s, having spent the majority of their lives in a 6x10 concrete cell. Their families have moved on, their children have grown up without them, and the world outside has changed beyond recognition. Unanswered questions haunt the system. Why does Texas maintain the most restrictive death row conditions in America when other states house condemned prisoners in less severe environments without security problems? Mississippi, for example, allows death row inmates to have contact visits with family, work prison jobs, and socialize during recreation time. Their security record is comparable to Texas's. So why the extreme isolation? The ongoing impact extends beyond individual prisoners. Guards who work death row also suffer psychological effects. Several former Polunsky corrections officers have spoken about the moral injury of watching men deteriorate mentally, knowing you're part of the system causing it. Some develop PTSD symptoms. Others become desensitized, which creates its own ethical concerns. Victim perspectives complicate the narrative. Some victims' families find peace knowing the person who murdered their loved one will eventually be executed. Others have come forward saying the death penalty didn't bring the closure they expected. Watching the execution just created more trauma. And some victims' families have explicitly opposed the execution of the person who harmed them, arguing that more killing doesn't heal anything. Was justice served, or did the system fail? That question becomes more complicated the deeper you look. Some men on Polunsky's death row committed horrific crimes. There's no doubt about their guilt, and their actions caused immeasurable suffering. But does that justify subjecting them to conditions that international human rights organizations classify as torture? Can a society claim moral authority when it inflicts suffering as policy? The Allan B. Polunsky Unit reveals an uncomfortable truth about American criminal justice. We've created a system that's less about justice and more about vengeance. We tell ourselves the death penalty is about accountability, but then we subject condemned prisoners to years or decades of psychological torture before we execute them. That's not justice. That's cruelty with a legal stamp. The lessons here cut deeper than death penalty debates. Polunsky demonstrates what happens when we stop seeing certain humans as deserving of basic dignity. When we decide someone has committed such heinous acts that we can do anything to them without moral consequence. That logic is dangerous because it doesn't stay contained. The dehumanization spreads, the cruelty becomes normalized, and eventually we've built a system that diminishes everyone involved. As of December 2024, Texas Death Row holds 178 inmates at the Polunsky Unit. They spend 23 hours a day in isolation. They wait months or years between execution dates, never knowing when the state will schedule their death. Some have been there for 30 years. Their minds have deteriorated. Their families have suffered, and society has become more callous to human suffering in the name of law and order. One haunting detail stays with everyone who studies this system. The state of Texas spends enormous resources keeping these men alive in isolation, providing just enough mental health care to prevent successful suicides, sometimes forcibly medicating them to restore competency, all so the state can eventually kill them according to schedule. The cruelty is the point. The suffering is intentional. The question we're left with is this: what kind of society are we building when our justice system is designed to break human beings before it kills them? When we torture people psychologically for years and call it administrative segregation? When we execute potentially innocent people because procedural rules matter more than truth? This channel covers the cases and systems that expose the failures of American criminal justice. The wrongful convictions, the institutional cruelty, the policies that destroy lives in the name of public safety. These are the stories that challenge our assumptions about punishment, redemption, and what justice actually means. Subscribe for weekly deep dives into the cases that reveal who we really are as a society. The men on Texas death row are waiting. Some are guilty of horrific crimes. Some may be innocent. All of them are human beings whose psychological destruction we're funding with tax dollars. Whatever you believe about the death penalty, the conditions at the Polunsky Unit should trouble anyone who believes in human dignity. Because if we can justify this level of cruelty against our worst criminals, what can't we justify? What do you think? Does extreme isolation serve any legitimate purpose? Or is it torture that diminishes us all? And would you want to know if someone you loved was innocent but trapped in this system? Let me know in the comments.